You know, Ellen White says in the book Education, when you look out there and you see the sparkle of intelligence in people's eyes, you know you're communicating. Now, sometimes after lunch, you look out there and you see something besides intelligence. So I want you to know I take this personally that I have been assigned this particular time slot. Now,
George, it was meant to be personal.
well, how long do I have? When am I supposed to quit? Yeah. It doesn't say John gets up until 3, so I must quit before 3, right? 2:45? Okay, good. Okay. I always get worried about those kind of things, and I've been told I can't walk too far here because I'm out of the light, and they want me to stay in the light. I told them they should have put a little 12-volt, kind of a cow shocker. Called a hog shocker, but not in this particular community of faith. Well, Ellen White wrote a lot of stuff. To one family, she wrote, don't, you knew that was going to be the first word, huh? Don't eat eggs. This family had something wrong with their children, and it was apparently there was something in those eggs she suggested that was related to sensuality with her children. Okay, don't eat eggs. That's pretty clear, right? Now, there were 2 physicians over in Australia, Dr. and Mrs. Kress, both MDs, both Americans, both health reformers. In fact, they were so zealous that they were dying from health reform, literally. They had discovered that there were so many things you shouldn't eat that they could no longer sustain health. Ellen White wrote to Dr. and Mrs. Kress talking about their regime as health deform. She said, if you want to live, now most health reformers do want to live. If you want to live, take 2 raw eggs every day, crack them in grape juice, and drink it, because eggs have medicinal properties. I mean, that's it. Raw eggs, no eggs. Now, by the way, Dr. and Mrs. Kress, that very day, started eating, drinking raw eggs. 50 or 60 years later, in their mid-80s, Dr. Kress was still practicing medicine in good health. And he was still drinking raw eggs. Now, those of you calculators, I don't want you calculating the number of raw eggs he ate and what kind of volume that would take in this particular... No, forget it. I will try to keep you along other tracks. No eggs? Now, by the way, which one will the average Adventist health reformer try to push upon you? Oh, no eggs, yeah. Nobody's ever tried to convince me on the raw egg one. But you see, it would be simple if they only had one quotation. Some people only got one quotation. What I call one quotation people. That's because either they don't like the rest of it or they haven't read very much. You see, but I got this problem. Which is the inspired statement? No eggs or raw eggs? The answer is both. Different people got different problems. And that every letter, every testimony, behind it, there's a person with a problem. Behind it, there's something specific. And we have forgotten that. Different people. You know, if two people, I almost said men, isn't that terrible? If two people are on opposite sides of a river and they want to get to an island in the middle, what would you do? You'd give them opposite advice. Yeah, Ellen White. She gives contradictory advice, or what appears to be contradictory advice, because there are different situations. West Texas. I was teaching in a two-teacher elementary school. I'd never seen a two-teacher elementary school. In fact, I couldn't call it a two-room school because we didn't have two rooms. We had two Sabbath school rooms with a hall down the middle and two toilets connected to a church. And I loved that little school. But the rains came. And I wondered what I should do with the children so they wouldn't tear the place up. I finally decided that I would buy table games. I can't remember all the games, but I do remember one. Checkers. And I had one man in that class who had three boys in my school, in my room. And the middle one, and the man was what we'd call a straight testimony man. You know what I mean? And his middle son could be very rigorous. One day, Stephen came to me, the middle boy, and he said to me, "Mr. Knight, do you know what my daddy says, that Mrs. White says about checkers?" And I said, "Stephen, I'm pretty sure that I know what your daddy says, that Mrs. White says about checkers. Don't play them." He looked at me like, "Yeah, I got you now." I said, "Stephen, have you ever read those statements?" He said, "No." I said, "I'll read them with you. But first, I have a question. I want you to go home and ask your daddy if it's all right to play Monopoly." Now, do you understand the principle of Monopoly? It's a very nice game. It takes tons of time, but the thing is to bankrupt thy neighbor. It's a really neat game. Take away all of his hotels, take away all of his houses, take away all of his property, and when you bankrupted him, you are the winner. Nice game. And it usually takes hours and hours to get somebody that destitute. And I have often thought that, you could draw a little hole in the center of the board and just call it suicide. When you finish the game, playing on 1929. Or if you want to play it on Sabbath, just call the little hole hell. Anyway, it is not a good, it's not based on Christian principles. Whatever's wrong with checkers, Monopoly's 50 times worse. Oh, I forgot all about the question. A couple days later, Stephen comes back and he says, "Mr. Knight, my daddy says it's all right to play checkers." Because why? Because Mrs. White didn't say anything about it. You see, an Adventist without a quotation is pretty hopeless. We got a quotation, we're like Pavlov's dog. You know Pavlov's dog, when the bell rings, the food was put there, and then when the bell rang, he salivated. Yeah, many of us are kind of reflexive. We got a quotation, we know exactly what to do. We don't have a quotation, we are dead in the water. Brain dead. No concept that there might be principles out there, and that maybe decisions should be made on principle. Anyway, I read these things to Stephen. I said, Stephen, after we got this far, I said, Stephen, would you rather be outside and play, or would you rather play checkers? Now, you've got to understand Stephen. He was, oh, boy. He said, Mr. Knight, you know. Yeah, he didn't. I said, would you gamble with these things? He looked quite indignant. I said, of course not. Which meant not in front of me. I said, Stephen, I think you've got some very serious problems in your life, but I don't think one of them is checkers. Now, it wasn't until years later when I found out how those statements came to be. What did Mrs. White ever write about checkers? Long history. James, her husband, had had several strokes, and he went to a health reform institute in New York, Dansville, our home on the hillside. And Dr. Jackson was there. And James went for his interview with Dr. Jackson, and he took one look at James, and he says, you're too serious. You need to stop thinking about religion. That's part. You are just too serious. Loosen up, man. What you need to do is dance and play checkers. Now, James really liked the therapy. Ellen was not quite so sure that that's what he needed, because she believed that trust in God and physical mental activity was what he would need. So she pulled him out of Dansville. Took him up to Greenville, Michigan, where they had a little farm. I don't know how they got a crop in the ground, but it came time to harvest the crop, and here's James he's still following the Jackson idea. Don't do anything useful. He says, Ellen, we've got to get this crop in. How are we going to do it? I'm going to go get the neighbors. They'll help us. Ellen put on her sneakers, ran out the back door, went to every neighbor. Said, when my husband comes, say no. James. When James got back that evening, he says, I can't understand it. Not one neighbor will help us. Ellen says, I guess we'll have to do it. She says, Willie'll throw up the hay, you drive, and I'll stack on the back of the wagon. That was just one of many maneuvers. She got James active, physically, mentally, spiritually. That was the beginning of his healing. Meanwhile, back in Battle Creek, the Adventists were going to start their own health reform institute, the Western Health Reform Institute. And there was only one Adventist physician in the whole world at that time, Dr. Horatio S. Lay. But he had worked in Dansville, New York. Now, Brother Lay was smart enough not to bring dancing with him. But he did bring checkers. Now, I don't know if Ellen White ever saw anything good in checkers, but I will say this. She did not feel that they were the best thing for recovering your health in that situation. She thought that minds ought to be engaged with active, positive things. Checkers may be good for some things, but they weren't good for that. That's where the checker statement came from. But back in those days, the Review and Herald was a live periodical. I mean, it was exciting. And so some wiseacre wrote in. I wish the Review and Herald was still a live periodical. Some wiseacre wrote in and said, who in the world is Ellen White? To say we shouldn't play checkers when everybody knows she carries a game around in her suitcase when she travels. That brought forth a second statement on checkers and a denial of that particular avocation. Behind every statement, there's a situation. It's January. Texas. I've gone to this school to be a third grade teacher and mind my business. The previous principal had threatened to quit one time too many, and everybody said amen. First school day back in January, I was now principal. First phone call. From a lady. This was the era of the mini skirt. She said, Brother Knight, we are so glad that you are principal, because now we know that the standards will be enforced. I said, Sister, just what is it that you'd like to tell me? She said, my daughter's skirts are too short. You know, the gift of tongues is sometimes saying nothing. I wanted to say, why don't you do something about it? You've got one child, I've got 200, and you want me to do your work. Now, that's what I wanted to tell her. But she didn't give me a whole lot of room. This woman really had the gift of speech. She was one of those type that she could be talking, you could put the phone down for 15 minutes, come back and say, uh-huh. Finally, she got to the place, and she said, in some academies, they say that 2 inches above the knee. Well, she was explaining this to me, and I had plenty of time to think, and so I began to imagine myself running around with a ruler in one hand, grabbing these high school girls by the knee. And then as my mind began to wander around, I thought, if you're 6'2", 2 inches above the knees, you're a mighty long dress. But I had a little 10th grader who was built somewhat like a bowling ball with arms and legs. 2 inches above her knee was halfway to her waist. And I saw this little gal bend over one day. That was the whole show. We decided that we would operate on the basis of principle. The dress must be neat, clean, and modest. And we did in conjunction with the young ladies and my female teachers. Neat, clean, and modest. And what's modest on one young lady may not be modest on another. But we would handle it privately at that point. But the interesting thing is, I had a quotation from Ellen White that could have solved the problem. Yeah. I mean, that you have a quotation from Ellen White, you can solve any problem, right? I mean, mine was very specific, very clear. You cannot get confused on what this statement says. It said dresses should be shortened 8 or 9 inches. Now, to shorten some of those skirts 8 or 9 inches would have put the bottom of the hem somewhere above the waistband. I chose not to use that quotation, even though we were both Adventists. Now, there's a reason Ellen White wrote that. Dresses back in those days could weigh as much as 35 pounds. They were held in often by whalebone corsets to squeeze ladies half to death so they could get the proper figure. And, we've heard a lot about automobile pollution. You know what they had before automobiles? Yeah, horses. And horses have two forms of pollution, solid and liquid. And in the 19th century, nobody cleaned that stuff up. There were tons of it laying all over the place. And in the summertime, since nobody had screens on their windows and they didn't have air conditioning, man, this stuff got ground into fine dust that seasoned everybody's foods. It was wonderful stuff. In the wintertime, it made wonderful mud. And these dresses, you see, are dragging through that stuff. And the male sport was spitting. Yeah. The spittoon is a late historical development. Males spit everywhere, including in the house. But polite males did not spit on the table. Now, the spit was bad enough, but tuberculosis was rampant. This wet, gooey stuff, along with the horse pollution. These skirts were dragging all that stuff up. In that context, Ellen White said skirts should be shortened 8 or 9 inches. You see, behind every statement, there's an historical circumstance. Now I'm going to shift gears just a bit, and I've got a roll. You know, back in the old days, I know you'll never believe this. Sometimes people got into arguments over Ellen White's statements. Yeah. Now, they tell me that doesn't happen in Oregon, so at least in southern Oregon where I live. But anyway, I'm going to show you a statement they got crosswise on in a certain school board out in California. It's a good one because it's got the word only in it. Parents should be the only, that's the key word, teachers of their children until they've reached 8 or 10 years of age. Third Testimonies, page 137. Parent, you got the key word? I mean, this is a nice one because it's there's no conditions here. You can whack your neighbor with this one. Yeah. The parents should be the only. Yeah. So this school board had a school that only had the upper elementary grades because they were being faithful. But some of the school board members said, wait a minute, the kids are running loose. What are we going to do? Let's make sense. Why make sense? We got a quotation from Ellen White. And we're going to be faithful. Now, this school board got so entangled that they couldn't go forward or backward. The interesting thing is, the school was on Ellen White's property. And she lived there. And so they called her down for a meeting. This ought to be required reading. 1904, this document was misplaced for 71 years. It was in the vault the whole time, but nobody saw it. 1975, manuscript release 404, the original manuscript number, it's on here somewhere. Manuscript 7, 1904, and it's now in third selected messages, most of it. I'm going to read a little bit, but first, you've got to remember the quotation. Parents should be the, you got it, only teachers until the children have reached 8 or 10 years of age. Now, the first thing they do is interview Ellen White. After all, it's her statement. Now, by the way, in that statement, there are no ifs, ands, and buts. It's an unconditional statement. This is Ellen White, those who assume the responsibility of parenthood should first consider whether they will be able to surround their children with proper influences. The home is both a family church and a family school. Here's the ideal, and I believe it. The basic institution of society is the home. Churches help the home. Schools help the home. This is the ideal. The home is central. Now she's getting down to the statement. Mothers, you could say parents, but she said mothers. Mothers should be able to instruct their little ones wisely during the earlier years of childhood. By the way, this is the best document that we have of Ellen White interpreting her own writings. Mothers should be able to instruct their little ones wisely during their early years of childhood if, what's the little words? Here's Ellen White explaining away straight testimony. Glad she's doing it. Could get me fired. If every mother were capable of doing this and would take the time, what's she saying? Some mothers aren't capable and some aren't willing. If every mother were capable of doing this and would take the time to teach her children the lessons that should be learned in early life, then all children could be kept in the home school until they're 8 or 9 or 10. Ellen White operates on two levels. Number one, the ideal. Number two, the reality of where people are. Watch this, because we got people that only collect the ideal statements and try to shove them on everybody. They don't recognize that Ellen White, in the real world, operated on two levels. She explains her own idealistic statement. She brings it down to reality. This is where the people are. If then. But many who enter the marriage relation fail of realizing all the sacred responsibilities that parenthood brings. Children drift hither and thither. There's nobody in the home capable of guiding them aright. Children who are surrounded by these unfortunate conditions are indeed to be pitied. If not afforded an opportunity for proper training outside the home, they are debarred from many privileges that by right every child should enjoy. Those who are unable to train their children aright should never have assumed the responsibilities of parents. Yeah, that's nice. What are you going to do with them, you know? But, because of their mistaken judgment, shall we make no effort to help their little ones to form right characters? God desires us to deal with these problems sensibly. Now, what's good sense got to do with using an Ellen White quotation? I know lots of people who make nonsense. Ellen White has been slain in the house of her friends. God desires us to deal with these problems sensibly. She goes on, here's a work that must be done for the families and for children as old as 7 and 8 and 9. We should have a lower department. By the time she gets finished with this, she's down to kindergartens, recommending them. She says, and she contextualizes it, when I wrote that, we didn't have any Adventist schools. She goes on, now my favorite. And she's going to quote her so-called followers. That is how it is. It was Ellen White. And my mind has been greatly stirred in regard to the idea, and then she quotes those who claim to be following her. Why, Sister White has said so-and-so, and Sister White has said so-and-so, and therefore we are going right up to it. What's her response? God wants us all to have common sense. He wants us to reason from common sense. Circumstances alter conditions. Circumstances change the relation of things. Therefore, I, from the light that God has given me, declare if there is a family that has not the capabilities of educating nor discipline and government of their own children, requiring obedience, the very best thing is to put them someplace where they will obey. This is a fantastic interchange. I could go on because Willie's going to talk pretty soon, and he's going to say, you know, Mother, underneath every statement, there's a principle. We ought to be applying the principle. And he says, some people take one quotation and make very far rulings and create problems. You bet they did. This whole Ellen White, even if you had a quotation, sister, you don't have to check your brain in at the door. Okay? That's good. That's good news. God has guidance for His people. He's given you some intelligence to apply that. Ellen White was plagued throughout her entire life by people misusing hardline quotations, ideal quotations. You know, we got these people, and I used to be one, okay? I can't go into this, but I used to be perfect. Promised God I'd be the first perfect Christian since Christ. Took me 8 years to burn out. 1969, I resigned from the Seventh-day Adventist ministry, decided to leave the church, wandered in a far country for 6 years. I was a misuser of Ellen White. I'm not sure if I was a stabber or a basher. I think I had the capability of doing both if I had the proper quotation. And I could tell you why nearly everybody would be lost, from Billy Graham all the way down to my local pastor, except me, of course. It's a terrible thing to be perfect. Everybody else, by definition, is wrong. What I've got to say is very serious today. I may be able to say it and smile. I suppose the way we've misused Mrs. White, perhaps we ought to cry. Too many unhealthy people have created Ellen White in their own image. Some of us have created God in our own image. Ungraceful, unkind, inflexible. Ellen White, I want to go on, was a Christian lady. She knew where to stand up. She had a gospel message. You know why I believe Ellen White's a prophet? I don't go for any of the old tests. Number one, she points me to Jesus. Number two, she points me to the Bible. That's it. She never points to herself. I can't get off on that. Well, our first school is in Battle Creek, Michigan. That school, even though Ellen wanted to buy a few more acres, they bought 12 acres for Battle Creek College. The outskirts, well, right in Battle Creek. And they had so many acres that they sold off 7 of them. That left them with 5 acres. It was an interesting school. Didn't have any Bible class. Didn't teach Bible. Not a required topic. Old Uriah Smith used to hobble over on his one leg. He only had one. The other one was sawed off on his kitchen table while he was about 12 or 13 without anesthetic. Nobody bothered to go to his lectures. He's a pretty dry lecturer. I'm positive there were a few, but it said in the bulletin you could come here and not even know this is an Adventist school. It said that in the bulletin. They didn't have any work program. It was all the classics. You go there 7 years studying Latin and Greek classics. You get a BA. By the 1890s, Ellen White was pretty sure that was on the wrong path. She knew it before that. But in the 1890s, she got an invitation to go to Australia. She wasn't sure the Lord was behind it when she went, but she was quite convinced after she got there. It was just the right distance from the General Conference, where she could do some experimenting, about 12,000 miles. And there, she and a reform cadre began the Avondale School. Avondale was built on 1,200 acres out in the country, 70 kilometers from Sydney. Had a work-study program, that's mental, physical balance. The Bible was at the center, the classics were out. Ellen White was excited about that school. She called it an object lesson. She called it a sample school, a model school, a pattern. And in 1900, Ellen White categorically stated that the school in Avondale is to be a pattern for other schools which shall be established among our people. And you know what? People began to look at Avondale and they said, man, that is the model. And somebody came up with the idea of the blueprint. That there's only one way to do it, because Ellen White said, this is a pattern. This is an object lesson. To do anything else would be something like sin. You understand what sin is? Transgressing an express command from Ellen White. Okay. Interestingly enough, that is not the approach that Ellen White took. I wrote this up some years ago called The Myth of the Inflexible Prophet. It's her followers. Her followers are never inflexible. It's her so-called followers. That book was published in a book called Myths in Adventism, out of print. Hope to have it back in print next year. And listen to the lady. This is written after Avondale. Now found in Counsels to Teachers, page 531. No exact pattern can be given for the establishment of schools in new fields. The climate, the surroundings, the condition of the country, the means at hand with which to work must all bear a part in shaping the work. What do you have to do? You have to contextualize. You have to study out how best to do it for that culture in that place with the amount of money you've got. Use your brain and begin to apply. Here's another one. Same general topic. This is 1901, manuscript 170. The Lord has not designed, this is the next decade after Avondale, the pattern school. The Lord has not designed any one exact plan in education. If I went far enough, she would say, what's your purpose? Create the school to fit your purpose. But I got a wonderful statement here. Oh man, do I like this statement, because it starts with never. Yeah. Do you understand what the word never means? I mean, how stupid can you be? Never is good, straight testimony kind of word. Can be used as a club or a spear. Never. That means throughout eternity. Never. Can the proper educate? This comes from Fundamentals of Christian Education, 312. This was written when they were buying that 1,200 acres for Avondale. Never can the proper education be given to the youth in this country or any other country. Oh, this is good. Never is universal in times of time. In this country or another country, man, that takes care of it in terms of all space. Man, we got a hot one here. Never can the proper education be given to the youth in this country or any other country unless they are separated a wide distance from the cities. And she gives the reason. The customs and practices in the cities unfit the minds of the youth for the entrance of truth. I understand that. I see Eldon over there. You remember that school ground I had down there in Houston when I was principal. I don't know if you knew me when I was principal, but anyway, you know the school. I used to have to go out there. This is an inner city Adventist school, Houston, Texas. I used to have to go out on Monday morning and pick up the prophylactics off my playground, throwing out from the apartment windows and mainlining needles. You want to see a topless nightclub? Come to my school. They're on all the avenues to get there. I started out in San Francisco, 1964. You know what advice I got from my senior pastor? Never, this is the only thing he ever told me. Never go into a man's room unless he's fully dressed. I mean, cities are interesting places. There are, Ellen White thought that's the ideal. I agree. Most of my work has been city work up until I went to Berrien Springs, which is really out there. I agree. That's the principle underneath. Never can the proper education be given to the youth in this country or any other country unless they're separated a wide distance from the cities. What happened? Oh man, Healdsburg College sold out in Northern California, that big metropolis of Healdsburg with its 3,000 people, and they moved up to the top of Howell Mountain, called it PUC. As I used to say when I was a student there, 10 miles from the nearest known sin. It was way out there. Battle Creek College sold out in Battle Creek and went out to Berrien Springs, out in the middle of a bunch of orchards. Around the world, Adventist schools became rural. That counsel was effective. It also gave us some extremely valuable land. Because the cities have come up around it, and now we got multi-million-dollar pieces of land out there. But now we got the problem with the cities. I don't want to get into that. Okay, that's good. That's pretty straightforward, wouldn't you say? Never. In this country? Oh, come on. Yeah. I got to go. I mean, fast. Okay, 9th volume of the Testimonies. Now we're starting to get converts in the early 20th centuries in the cities. Listen, so far as possible. It's the same lady that said never? So far as possible, these schools should be outside the cities. That's the ideal. She's never changed. But, 9th Testimonies 2:01, but in the cities, there are many children who could not attend schools away from the cities, and for the benefit of these, schools should be opened in the cities as well as in the country. The ideal, the reality. Unfortunately, we have people all over the place who only collect the strongest statements, taking no account of the circumstances or the moderate Ellen White. Oh, I could go into other illustrations, but I think I better. I don't know. I'm going to tempt fate. Battle Creek, we pretty much got burned out of Battle Creek early in the 20th century. They moved to Washington, D.C. They created a new set of institutions, including a new school and a new hospital at the edge of Washington, D.C. I mean, hardly, this is not a wide distance, I'm sorry. There's no 1,200 acres. He says, talking about that, the location, they only had 50 acres. 25 for the sanitarium, Washington Sam. 25 for what's now Columbia Union College. The location has been secured for our school and sanitarium is all that could be desired. The land resembles representations that have been shown me by the Lord. This is not separated by a large distance, okay? No, this school has its own purpose. It is well adapted for the purpose for which it is to be used. There is on it ample room for a school and a sanitarium. Well, I got to move down the track. Ellen White sought to approach the ideal, but she was never rigid in application. She was out to apply the principles in a sensible manner that always kept the goal in mind. A central problem all of us face is that of balance. One polar extreme is to unthinkingly rely upon prophetic authority. I have a quotation. That solves everything. While the other extreme is to lean on rationality in an unhealthy manner that allows it to become a rationalization for what we wanted to do anyway. Our rational understanding must always be guided by inspired counsel. On the other hand, the truth of inspired counsel must always be understood and applied through the aid of our rationality, that is, our brain. To rely on either inspired counsel or rational understanding without the other is a fatal misconception. Authoritative revelation and sanctified reason go hand in hand as we seek to understand God in Christian living. God gave us the power of creative thought. Come, let us reason together. And He expects us to use it. Christian living is a dynamic experience that is inseparably linked to thinking and acting upon one's thoughts. Now, if you're a dead Christian, don't worry. You don't have to think. Okay? Christianity is therefore a moral enterprise in which people have corporate and personal responsibility in the eyes of God. Rigidity and inflexibility of thought is the antithesis of Christianity. The task of the living Christian is to search out God's revelations and then to seek to apply them to current living without doing violence to the intent of their underlying principles. That takes personal dedication as well as sensitivity to the guidance of the Holy Spirit. It was in that connection with a living Spirit that Ellen White lived and sought to guide the Adventist Church. The same stance was exemplified in the life of Christ. You have heard it said. And He plows away the Adventist tradition. Jewish tradition. But I say unto you. And He drives down to the principle. Christ, in His flexible manner, was able to meet all classes of people, all the way from Pharisees clear down to prostitutes. He had no problem. We had most problem with the Pharisees. Pharisees are always the most difficult to deal with. Jesus didn't have problems with the unchurched. It was can I say this out loud? In such a hallowed hall. It was the church members that were problematic. Particularly those that had the pocket full of tradition, or had only read one half of the Old Testament, the half they liked. Too many people are out creating Ellen White in their own image. Well, I'm going to tell you God's worst job, Worst job is trying to say something to you people. The hardest job God ever had. I got to get through this quick. But I used to be an elementary school teacher, and you got a whole classroom. You got some people who are so sensitive they'll cry if you look at them crosswise. Yeah, right there. Yeah, I bet you'd cry if you were in the third grade. I could make you cry. But I got a guy in the back row. I could hit him on the head with a baseball bat, and he wouldn't even know I'm there. Now, I got to speak to this whole class. They've all got just a little disruptive. I come in, man, I'm loaded for bears. I got it, but I can't. I got to say it powerfully because I got to reach that guy in the back. So I came in, loaded for bear. I crushed the little gal in the front row. He still didn't hear me. Ellen White, James talks about it. I don't have time to read it. March 17, 1868, review. Ellen White makes a strong statement because you're dragging your feet. But those who are too sensitive take it too far and become fanatics. This is what James is saying. And then, to get the fanatics straightened out, he says, the next month, she has to write. Say, you went too far. Now, the people that didn't do anything, the hardheads, they said, see, we were all right in the first place. We went too far. So you find Ellen White, I've been collecting these statements. One time she'll make a strong statement. The next month she'll come back and say, please don't go so far. And here they are. The fanatics are taking one statement. The hardheads are taking the other statement. And James is saying, man, give the lady a break. You guys are destroying the work. Now here's one that everybody ought to read. This ought to be required morning worship at breakfast every day. It's on health reform, but it could be any other topic. Proper use of the testimonies in regard to health reform. Third selected messages, 285 to 287. Questions are coming in from the brethren and sisters, making inquiries in regard to health reform. Statements are made that some are taking delight in the testimonies upon health reform and making it a test. Can you believe that? They select statements made in regard to some articles of diet that are presented as objectionable, statements written in warning and instruction to certain individuals who were entering or had entered on an evil path. They dwell on these things and make them as strong as possible, weaving their own peculiar traits, objectionable traits of character in with these statements, and carry them with great force, thus making them a test and driving them where they will do only harm. We see those who will select from the testimonies the strongest expressions, and without bringing in or making any account of the circumstances under which the cautions and warnings are given, make them of force in every case. Thus they produce unhealthy impressions upon the minds of the people. Now, by the way, I used to get 5 or 6 people walk out about this time. Don't we have any normal people here? Okay, you're going to stay. It always bothers me when nobody walks out. Okay. There are always those who are ready to grasp anything of a character which they can use to rein up people to a close, severe test, and who work elements of their own characters into the reforms. They will go at the work making a raid upon the people, with a handful of Ellen White quotations, of course. Picking out some things in the testimonies, they drive them upon everyone in disgust rather than win souls. They make divisions when they might and should make peace. What's new? Ellen, every problem we face today in the use and misuse of Ellen White's writings, she faced in her own day. Now I'm going to close with that. Don't say I'm going to close. Man, somebody will be up here taking my place. I'm going to close this little section off. You'll never find this one in a self-supporting compilation. Let the testimonies speak for themselves. Let not individuals gather up the very strongest statements given for individuals and families and drive these things because they want to use the whip and have something to drive. She can speak fairly plainly, can't she? I don't know why I don't find this one in a lot of compilations. I believe in the whole Ellen White. Both sides. Some people accuse me of not believing in Ellen White. I believe in Ellen White. I believe she meant what she said. There's the ideal quotations. There's the moderating quotations. There's the contexts. There's the responsibility of using your brain to interpret these things. And most of all, she says it in here, I didn't read it, you better do it with love. You know, I once knew a Sabbath keeper who was meaner than the devil. I once even met a vegan who was meaner than the devil. Yeah. Want to talk about a frustrated lady? I see Scott's getting nervous over here. You know, I used to want to be the prophet. I thought maybe I could be the next Ellen White, but I've decided it's a bad job. This is written in the General Conference, brethren, also found in third selected messages, 82 and 83. What I might say this is written in the General Conference. What I might say in private conversations would be so repeated as to make it mean exactly to what it would have, what I might say in private conversations would be so repeated so as to make it mean exactly opposite to what it would have meant had the hearers been sanctified in mind or spirit. I'm afraid to speak even to my friends, for afterwards I hear, Sister White said this, or Sister White said that. My words are so wrested and misinterpreted that I'm coming to the conclusion that the Lord desires me to keep out of large assemblies and refuse private interviews. What I say in what I say is reported in such a perverted light that it is new and strange to me. It is mixed with words spoken by men to sustain their own theories. One last statement written by an Anglican priest who understands Adventism a whole lot better than some of us. When I interpret Mrs. White at her best, I hear her calling the Adventist community back to the Bible. That's all you got from Ellen White. That'd be enough right there. I hear her calling the Adventist community back to the Bible as the final norm in all matters of controversy. Yet in the present shaking within Adventism, I have observed a frantic rushing to the voluminous writings of Ellen White to find statements that will score a point against the opponent. This is to say nothing of the dreaded compilations which wrench this saying and that saying out of context and then place them side by side to form the authoritative last word in the struggle. This type of action neither honors the Bible nor Mrs. White. I mentioned that Mrs. White wrote voluminously. Those writings took place over a considerable period of time. They took place in specific contexts, and they stood in definite relationship to each other. To use those writings correctly, so as not to misrepresent them, requires a great deal more skill than is generally being exhibited. Adventists make her like she's got a wax nose. She's turned this way, then turned that way, and then this way again. If Adventists wish to bring Mrs. White to the place where she has no authority at all in their movement, let them keep using her writings as a source for point scoring in their intra-church squabbles. Not bad for an Anglican. God has given us a prophet. I would like to challenge the Adventist Church in Oregon to begin to use that gift with more insight and responsibility and Christianity. God wants to lead His people. By the way, you get a new convert, don't start them out with diets and foods, okay? Take them to the Bible. If you go to the Bible, don't start out with Leviticus, please. If the person starts out and he enjoys Leviticus, throw him back. Not a keeper. Don't even start with Genesis and go through the Bible. When they get halfway through the book of Exodus, they're going to really get discouraged because they don't know what to do with 15 chapters on how to construct the tabernacle. Start them with the Gospels. Start them with the Gospels. And then move something like letters and the Bible stories, Old Testament Bible stories. Block them out. I got to move fast now. Block them out. Then letters. Tell them behind every letter there's a problem. Oh, that sounds like Ellen White, huh? Yeah. Behind every letter there is a problem. When they know the Bible. Okay, ready for Ellen White? Start out with Jesus. Desire of Ages, Steps to Christ, rest of the stories, the conflict. Now they want to, then tell them the difference between a compilation. Compilations are not to be read all the way through. You know what? If you had all the problems, I'm looking at you, sister. You had all the problems, and there's the counsels and diets and foods, you would not be alive. You probably got about 5% of them. You know how to tell which 5% you got? Those are the ones you skip over. Yeah. Okay. But before that, they should read Ministry of Healing. Put the health message in its Christ-centered context. And if you want to read, I don't think you... Now, use the other ones for research, okay? But I challenge you. If you read the Gospels and Desire of Ages and Steps to Christ once a year, this would be a transformed audience. Stick with Christ. Stick with the positive, recognizing that all of those other problems were written to thousands of different people at different times over a 70-year ministry. The council books were never meant to be read like Desire of Ages was meant to be read. Get that through your head and get healthy. Nobody will ever be saved by what they stopped doing. Start loving Jesus and loving your neighbor. And be very careful how you read Desire of Ages, because Ellen White is very clear that there's only one standard for the judgment. Yeah, Desire of Ages 637, playing on Matthew 25, where everybody's surprised in the sheep and the goats, the last judgment. Have you loved your neighbor? That's it. Have you loved your neighbor? She says that's the one point on which the judgment turns. And by the way, it's all right to love your neighbor in the church. Yeah, even that kind of neighbor. Even if they disagree with you. Even if they're disagreeable.